Ever bought a little basil plant from the grocery store, only to watch it slowly fade away after a couple of weeks? Or maybe you've wished you had enough basil to make fresh pesto whenever you wanted without spending a fortune at the market. Well, in this video, I'm going to show you how to turn one single basil plant into an endless supply that just keeps multiplying. We're going to cover everything from taking your very first cuttings all the way through, creating a self-sustaining cycle where you never need to buy basil again. Plus, stick around to the end where I'll share a simple preservation trick that lets you enjoy your homegrown basil all year long, even through the coldest months. Let's get into it. Basil is one of the most rewarding herbs you can grow at home, and it's also one of the easiest to multiply once you understand one simple concept. You don't need seeds. You don't need fancy equipment. All you need is one healthy plant and a glass of water to get started. Once you learn this technique, you'll have more basil than you know what to do with. So let's start by understanding why this works so well. Here's the beautiful thing about basil. It actually wants to grow roots from its stems. Every basil plant has these little bumps along the stem called nodes. These are the spots where leaves attach to the main stem, and they're packed with natural hormones that tell the plant to produce roots. When you put a cutting in water, all those hormones collect at the bottom of the stem, right where you made your cut, and that triggers rapid root development. This is why basil is one of the absolute best herbs for propagation. It roots quickly, it roots reliably, and once those roots get going, the plant takes off. Understanding this gives you a huge advantage because now you know exactly where to make your cuts and why it matters. Now let's talk about selecting the right plant to start with. You don't need anything expensive here. In fact, some of the cheapest supermarket basil plants work perfectly fine for this. What you're looking for is a plant that has several stems with healthy green leaves at the top. Don't worry if the plant looks a little leggy or scraggly. That's actually common with grocery store basil because they're grown in crowded conditions without much light. The important thing is that you have enough stem material to work with and that the leaves at the growing tips look healthy and green, not yellow or wilted. If you have the choice between a few different plants, pick the one with the most stems coming out of the soil. More stems means more potential cuttings, which means you'll be able to multiply faster right from the start. One small plant can easily give you 6, 8, even 10 cuttings if it has enough stems to work with. And here's a little secret. Even if the plant looks a bit sad and anemic, as long as those growing tips are still pushing out new leaves, that plant has plenty of life left in it for what we're about to do. All right, let's get into actually taking your cuttings. This is where the magic starts. What you want to do is look for stems that are at least 3 to 4 inches long with several sets of leaves. You're going to cut just below a node, and remember, a node is where a set of leaves attaches to the stem. You want to cut about a 1/4 inch below that node. The reason this matters is because that node area is where most of your roots are going to form. All those growth hormones I mentioned earlier, they concentrate right there, and when the cutting is sitting in water, that's the zone that's going to explode with new roots. For the ideal cutting, you want at least 2 nodes that will be underwater and then 3 or 4 healthy leaves remaining above the water line. This gives you the best balance between root production and the plant's ability to photosynthesize and feed itself while it's developing roots. Now, before you put those cuttings in water, you need to remove any leaves that would end up submerged. This is really important. If leaves sit underwater, they're going to rot, and that rot can spread and kill your cutting before it ever has a chance to root. Just pinch or snip off any lower leaves, leaving a clean stem at the bottom with your healthy leaves up top. I usually end up with cuttings that have about 2 inches of bare stem at the bottom and then a nice cluster of 4 to 6 leaves at the top. That's the sweet spot. One thing I want to mention here. You might be tempted to take really tiny cuttings to maximize how many you can get from one plant. And yes, you technically can root very small cuttings, but your success rate drops significantly. Those tiny cuttings just don't have enough stored energy to push out roots and sustain themselves at the same time. I've found that slightly larger cuttings with more leaf surface root faster and grow into stronger plants. It's better to get 6 robust cuttings than 12 weak ones that might not make it. Once your cuttings are prepared, it's time to get them rooting. Fill a clean glass or jar with room temperature water. You don't need anything fancy here. A mason jar works great, or even a drinking glass. Just make sure it's clean so you're not introducing any bacteria that could cause problems. Place your cuttings in the water so that the bottom 2 nodes are submerged, but the leaves stay above the water line. Set them somewhere they'll get bright indirect light. A sunny windowsill can work, but honestly, if you have a simple grow light, that's even better, because you can control the conditions. For the first few days, don't blast them with intense light. The cuttings can't take up much water yet because they don't have roots, so they can't handle high light intensity. Once you start seeing roots emerge, usually within about 7 to 10 days, you can gradually increase the light. Speaking of roots, let me tell you what to look for. At first, you'll notice tiny white bumps forming at the nodes underwater. That's the beginning of root development. Over the next week or so, those bumps will elongate into actual roots. You want to see roots that are at least an inch or 2 long, with some branching before you move to the next step. Nice white roots with a branch structure means your cutting is ready for soil. In my experience, this rooting phase takes about 2 to 3 weeks, depending on your conditions. Warmer temperatures speed things up significantly. If you can keep your cuttings around 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, you'll see much faster root development than if they're sitting in a cool room at 65 degrees. One trick I use is placing the jars on a seedling heat mat. That gentle bottom warmth really accelerates root growth. Change the water every few days to keep it fresh and oxygenated. Stagnant water can become a breeding ground for bacteria, and your cuttings will root faster in clean water anyway. Now we're ready to move those rooted cuttings into soil, and I want to prepare you for something. There's going to be a short adjustment period where growth seems to stall. Don't panic. This is completely normal. Here's what's happening. Your cuttings have developed water roots, which are slightly different from soil roots. When you transplant into soil, the plant needs a few days to adapt. The roots have to get used to drawing moisture and nutrients from soil instead of water, and during this transition, top growth slows down or even stops temporarily. But once those roots acclimate, growth takes off again, often faster than before, because soil provides better nutrition than plain water. For your growing medium, I recommend a good quality potting mix with some perlite mixed in. The perlite improves drainage and adds air pockets to the soil, which roots really appreciate. Basil doesn't like sitting in waterlogged soil, so that extra drainage is important. Use small pots at first, maybe 3 or 4 inches across. Fill them with your soil mix, make a hole in the center, and gently place your rooted cutting in. Be careful with those delicate new roots. Cover them up and press the soil gently around the stem. Water thoroughly after transplanting so the soil settles around the roots with no air pockets. For the first few days after transplanting, keep the soil consistently moist but not soggy. The roots are still adjusting, and they need easy access to water while they adapt. Once you see new leaf growth starting, usually within a week or so, you'll know the roots have established themselves and you can back off to a more normal watering routine. By the way, if you're finding this helpful so far, take a second to subscribe so you don't miss future videos. All right, let's keep going. Now that your cuttings are in soil and starting to grow, let's talk about giving them the best conditions to really thrive. Light is crucial for basil. These plants love bright light, and the more light you give them, the stockier and bushier they'll grow. If you're growing near a window, a south-facing window is ideal in most parts of the country. But honestly, unless you're in the middle of summer, natural window light often isn't enough to produce really robust basil plants. The stems get long and stretched out as the plant reaches for more light and the leaves stay small. This is why I'm a big fan of using grow lights for indoor basil. Even a basic LED grow light makes a tremendous difference. Your plants will have shorter spaces between the leaf sets, thicker stems, and larger, darker green leaves. If you noticed in my experience, plants under grow lights versus plants on a windowsill look completely different after just a few weeks. The ones under lights were lush and deep green, while the windowsill plants were pale and struggling, even though they were getting what seemed like decent sunlight. Temperature matters too. Basil is a warm weather herb, and it grows best when temperatures stay between 70 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Growth slows dramatically below 65 degrees, and if it gets too cold, the leaves can start to darken and the plant gets stressed. If your home runs cool, especially in winter, consider using a heat mat under your pots, or at least keeping your basil in the warmest room of the house. Once your basil plants are established and growing strong, I want you to start feeding them. Basil is a leafy herb, so it responds really well to nitrogen-rich fertilizer. A balanced liquid fertilizer works fine, or you can use one that's slightly higher in nitrogen. I feed my basil about once a week during active growth, and the difference is remarkable. The leaves get larger, the color deepens to that rich green you want, and the overall growth rate picks up noticeably. Just don't overdo it. Follow the directions on whatever fertilizer you're using, or even dilute it to half strength if you're feeding weekly. Too much fertilizer can actually burn the roots and cause more problems than it solves. All right, here's where things get really exciting. Once your transplanted cuttings have been growing in soil for about 3 weeks and have put on some good size, it's time to prune them. And this pruning step is important whether or not you want more plants, because it's what transforms a tall, leggy basil into a thick, bushy one. Let me explain what's happening inside the plant. Basil naturally wants to grow straight up. It puts all its energy into that main growing tip at the top, and the little side shoots lower down on the stem stays small and dormant. But when you cut off that top section, you remove what's called apical dominance. Suddenly, the plant redirects all that growth energy into those side shoots, and instead of one tall stem, you get 4 or 5 or even more branches growing out. Each of those branches will eventually develop its own side shoots, and your plant just keeps getting things. The numbers multiply quickly. Starting with one small grocery store basil, within about 2 months you can easily have 15, 20, even more individual plants. And if you kept going, you could have hundreds. It really does snowball once you get the cycle rolling. Let me put some real numbers to this so you can see what I mean. Let's say you start with one plant and take 6 cuttings from it. Those 6 cuttings root and grow for about 3 weeks. Then you prune each of them and get 3 or 4 new cuttings from each plant. That's another 18 to 24 new cuttings. Plus, your original 6 plants are now bushier and still growing. Another 3 weeks later, you can prune all of those again. You can see how quickly this adds up. And the best part is you control the pace. If you have enough basil, just harvest the tops for cooking instead of rooting them. If you want more plants, put those cuttings in water. You decide how big your basil empire gets. Now let me walk you through some common problems you might run into and how to solve them. First, if your cuttings are wilting badly right after you take them, they're probably losing water faster than they can take it up. This often happens if you took cuttings during the heat of the day, or if they're sitting in direct hot sunlight. The fix is to take cuttings in the morning when the plant is fully hydrated and keep fresh cuttings in bright indirect light rather than harsh direct sun until they develop roots. Second, if you notice the stems of your cuttings turning brown or mushy at the bottom while they're in water, that's rot setting in. This usually happens when leaves are left submerged underwater, or when the water hasn't been changed often enough and bacteria have built up. Remove any rotting cuttings immediately so they don't contaminate the others. Change to fresh, clean water, and make sure no leaves are underwater. Going forward, change the water every 2 or 3 days. Third, if your rooted cuttings seem to stall completely after transplanting to soil and don't recover after a week or 2, the roots may have been damaged during transplanting, or the soil might be staying too wet. Basil roots are delicate, especially water roots, so handle them gently. And make sure your soil has good drainage. If it stays soggy, roots can suffocate and rot. Adding more perlite to your mix helps prevent this. Fourth, if your established plants are growing tall and leggy with lots of space between the leaves, they need more light. This stretched growth is the plant reaching desperately toward whatever light source it can find. Move them closer to a window or add a grow light. The new growth will come in much more compact. Fifth, if the leaves are turning yellow, especially the lower leaves, your plant probably needs fertilizer. Basil is a hungry plant when it's growing actively, and plain potting soil runs out of nutrients after a few weeks. Start feeding with a balanced liquid fertilizer, and you should see improvement within a week or 2. Sixth, if you see tiny insects on your plants, most likely fungus gnats or aphids, act quickly before they spread. Fungus gnats are those little flies hovering around the soil, and they usually mean you're overwatering. Let the soil dry out more between waterings, and they'll diminish. Aphids cluster on new growth and can be washed off with a strong spray of water or treated with insecticidal soap. Catching pest problems early makes them much easier to manage. Now for that bonus tip I promised you at the beginning. Once you have all this beautiful basil growing, you're going to want a way to preserve it so you can enjoy it, even when your plants aren't producing as heavily. Here's my favorite method, and it's incredibly simple. Make basil ice cubes. Take your fresh basil leaves, wash them, and pack them into ice cube trays. Pour just enough olive oil over the leaves to cover them, then freeze. Once frozen, pop the cubes out and store them in a freezer bag. Whenever you're cooking and want that fresh basil flavor, just drop a cube right into your pan. The oil melts and releases all that beautiful basil flavor. It's almost as good as fresh, and it means your summer harvest can last you all through winter. I make several trays of these every year, and honestly, I never run out.